The vase fell in less than half a second, but in Douglas Mercer's memory it would never fall quickly. It would hang forever at the edge of the side table in the long white light of that Friday morning, tipping slowly away from the safety of the polished wood, turning just enough for the blue hand-painted flowers around its neck to catch the sun before gravity claimed it. He would remember the small sound before the crash, the almost delicate scrape of porcelain against varnish, and he would remember the way Serena's leather bag strap swung back toward her hip after striking the vase, neat and casual and finished with its work. He would remember that he was 3 full steps away, standing beside the display cabinet with a cotton cloth in his right hand, his left hand resting lightly against the frame of the shelf he had been dusting. He would remember that he had not moved, not reached, not leaned, not breathed hard enough to disturb so much as a curtain. And still, before the last shard stopped spinning across the hardwood floor, Serena Mercer looked at the broken pieces, then looked straight at him and said, "You did this." For a moment, Douglas did not answer because the accusation was too clean. It arrived too quickly, too smoothly, with no confusion attached to it. It was not a startled sentence. It was not the confused reflex of a person trying to understand how something valuable had just been destroyed. It was a statement selected before the evidence had even settled. The porcelain scattered in every direction across the floorboards he had laid and sanded and sealed himself 37 years earlier. One jagged piece slid under the leg of the armchair where Margaret used to sit on Sunday afternoons, with her reading glasses low on her nose. Another piece struck the baseboard beneath the window with a crisp little tap, then lay still. The room became so quiet that Douglas could hear the clock in the hallway, the old brass one Margaret's father had given them after the wedding, ticking once, twice, 3 times, marking the seconds after Serena created a new version of reality and waited for him to enter it. "I didn't touch it," Douglas said, keeping his voice low. "Don't lie." Serena cut him off so sharply that the words seemed to slice across the room. Her face had changed, but not into anger, not exactly. Anger had heat in it. Serena's face had calculation, and Douglas had been around enough job sites and court disputes and contractor fights to know the difference between a person reacting and a person maneuvering. "You were right there, always hovering like that, always in the middle of everything, ruining things and then acting confused." Tiffany Corwell, Serena's closest friend, made a sound that was almost a laugh, but quieter, smoother, safer. She stood near the doorway with one arm tucked across her waist and the other hand lifting her phone, as if she might record something if the scene improved. Tiffany was one of those women who never began a cruelty on her own, but always joined one quickly, as if she had been waiting to be invited into it. She looked at Douglas, then at the shattered vase, then back at Serena with practiced concern. "Honestly," she said, "letting him stay here was a mistake. You can tell just by looking at him that he doesn't understand boundaries." Douglas felt the word "stay" settle in his chest like a stone. A stay in his own house, the house at 114 Church Street in Charleston, South Carolina. The house whose foundation he had dug in 1987 when his back was strong and his hands could work from dawn until dark without shaking. The house he had framed beam by beam. The house whose windows he had set himself because he did not trust anyone else to place them true. The Hughes where his son Caleb learned to walk, where Margaret planted rosemary along the back fence, where hurricanes had rattled the shutters and failed to take the roof, where every board remembered some earlier version of his life. He had built it to last, not to impress. Impressive things looked good in photographs. Lasting things held weight when no one was watching. He had told Caleb that once years ago, back when the boy still followed him around with a hammer too big for his arm. But Caleb had grown up and married Serena and stopped asking how things were built. Serena took out her phone. The movement was immediate. Not after debate, not after tears. Not after even one real attempt to examine the truth. She lifted it, tapped the screen, and brought it to her ear. Her voice changed before the call connected. It softened in the way Douglas had come to fear, because Serena's softness was never surrender. It was costume. "Beatrice," she said, exhaling delicately, "I am so sorry to call like this." Douglas stood with the dust cloth still in his hand, while Tiffany lowered her eyes toward the broken vase, as if watching a private performance. "Yes," Serena continued, "it's the vase, the one you gave me. My father-in-law knocked it over." She paused, and her eyes shifted toward Douglas just enough to make sure he understood she wanted him to hear it. "Douglas," he was standing right beside it. I know how special it was. I wanted you to hear it from me before you came by and noticed it missing. I would never want you to think I didn't treasure it." She sounded near tears now. Douglas stared at her, and for the first time since Caleb had brought her into the house, he felt not irritation, not embarrassment, not wounded pride, but a cold and sober recognition. There were people who lied to escape consequences, and there were people who lied because it gave them pleasure to watch others stand trapped inside the lie. Serena belonged to the second kind. He understood it then. He understood it so clearly that the room seemed to sharpen around him, every piece of furniture and every strip of sunlight, and every porcelain shard becoming painfully distinct. He had been living with someone who did not simply bend the truth. She replaced it. When she ended the call, she slid the phone back into her bag without a tremor and walked toward the kitchen without another word to him. Tiffany followed, but not before glancing at Douglas with a faint smile that carried no humor at all. Their voices resumed from the kitchen a moment later, light and almost cheerful, the way people sound after completing a task. Douglas set the dust cloth on the cabinet slowly, because his hands needed something deliberate to do. He looked down at the floor. He wanted to kneel and pick up the pieces. The impulse came from 40 years of work. When something broke in a house, he fixed it or cleared it or protected someone from stepping on it. But he did not move. Not yet. He walked to the front door, opened it, and stepped onto the porch. The Charleston morning was already warm. Church Street lay quiet beneath a pale sun. The old live oaks held their shadows over the sidewalk. Across the yard, behind the front window of the house next door, Earl Davenport stood with a garden hose in one hand, motionless, watching. Earl was 70. And built like a man who had once been broader than age now allowed. He had lived next to Douglas for 15 years, maybe closer to 20, if Douglas counted the long stretches after Margaret died, when time stopped arranging itself properly. Earl did not gossip, did not insert himself into other people's family matters, did not shake his head at nothing. But that morning, when his eyes met Douglas's through the glass, Earl lowered the hose slowly and gave one small shake of his head before the curtain fell back into place. Not surprise. Warning. Douglas sat down in the porch chair he had built from leftover pine boards in 2003 and looked out at the street. Behind him, inside the house, Serena laughed at something Tiffany said. It was not loud, not dramatic. That made it worse. It belonged to a normal morning, a normal visit, a normal cruelty, done cleanly, with no raised voice and no apology required. Douglas rested both palms on his knees and thought about foundations. He thought about the way small cracks travel upward when ignored. He thought about water entering behind a wall for months before the stain appears. He thought about how many times he had walked through this house telling himself things were manageable. Manageable had become the word he used for humiliation when he was too tired to name it correctly. That night, he sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the smallest room at the end of the hall and listened to Serena's voice travel through the walls from the master bedroom. She was on the phone again. He could not make out the words, only the tone, low and assured, broken occasionally by a soft laugh. Caleb was home by then, but he was quiet in the way he had become quiet over the years. A quietness that did not feel peaceful. It felt drained. Douglas had noticed it slowly, then all at once. The way Caleb looked at Serena before answering simple questions. The way he let her handle every bill, every appointment, every decision that touched money. The way he said, "Serena takes care of that," not with gratitude, but with the dull obedience of a man repeating something he had learned not to challenge. Douglas turned toward the old photograph on his nightstand. Caleb at 10 years old, grinning with a hammer in his hand beside the half-framed back bedroom of this very house. The hammer had been too big for him. Douglas had told him so. Caleb had said he did not care and asked to try. First swing missed the nail entirely. Second bent it sideways. Third drove it clean and flush. And Caleb had looked up with a kind of pride that made Douglas feel, for one impossible second, that fatherhood might be something he could do correctly after all. "Again, Dad," Caleb had said. "Let me do it again." Douglas looked at the photograph until his eyes burned. The boy in that picture was still somewhere inside the man, who now signed whatever Serena put in front of him. Douglas had to believe that. If he stopped believing it, he did not know what would remain. At 5 the next morning, sleep still nowhere near him, Douglas made coffee and carried the mug to the porch. The street was dark enough that the windows across the way looked black. Earl's front door opened before sunrise, as it always did. He stepped out in his canvas jacket, saw Douglas sitting there and paused. "No sleep either," Earl said. "Not much, eh?" Earl came to his rail and looked toward the street, not toward Douglas. For a while they stood in the silence that grows between neighbors, who have known each other long enough not to fill every space. Then Earl said, "You know what I've learned after 70 years, Doug?" Douglas waited. The things that blindside a man are almost never things he didn't see coming. They're the things he saw coming and chose not to look at directly. Douglas turned his head slowly. "Is there something you want to tell me, Earl?" Earl looked at him then. The old man's face was steady, but something behind his eyes had weight. "Not yet," he said, "but when the time's right, you'll hear it." He went inside and closed the door softly. "Not yet." Those two words stayed with Douglas through breakfast, through the dull scrape of Serena's chair when she entered the kitchen, through the way she did not look at him while pouring coffee, through Caleb asking whether anyone had seen his blue tie and Serena telling him without lifting her eyes from her phone that if he organized his things like an adult he would not have to ask. Caleb apologized for a missing tie in his father's kitchen. Douglas watched him and said nothing. The silence tasted like rust. The next day, Saturday, Douglas went into the backyard with pruning shears and worked along the old magnolia near the fence line. It was the kind of work that settled him. Branch by branch, cut only what was dead, leave what still had life. Do not mistake weather damage for rot. Do not cut in anger. He had learned all that from trees as much as from houses. He was trimming a branch that had gone gray at the tip when Patricia Sims rose from behind the low fence separating their yards, dirt on her knees and canvas gloves on her hands. "Douglas," she said carefully, "are you doing all right?" He looked at her, and in the slight pause before he answered, he understood she was not asking about the magnolia. "Getting there." Patricia glanced toward his back windows, then back at him. She was 62, sharp-eyed, widowed, and not given to wasting words. She had lived next door 11 years, and noticed more than most men would survive having noticed. She pulled off one glove slowly. "Can I tell you something and have it stay between us for now?" Douglas set the shears on the fence post. "Go ahead." Patricia drew a breath. "Last Tuesday I was down here trimming the fence line. I was crouched low so Serena wouldn't have seen me from the yard. She was in that far corner behind the rose bushes, on the phone, talking low." Patricia looked uncomfortable now but not uncertain. "I caught only part of it but I heard enough. She said this location was the best one on the street. She said the old man wouldn't be a problem much longer. Then she said they just needed to pick the right time." Douglas did not move, and then she mentioned Hargrove Properties. The afternoon seemed to narrow around the name. "You're sure?" "I'm sure enough that I wrote it down when I went inside." Patricia's voice hardened slightly, not at him but at the memory. "I went back and forth about telling you. I told myself maybe I misunderstood. Then I thought about the way she looks at you when she thinks no one is paying attention. I thought about the vase yesterday. I thought about this house and what you built here, and I decided you had the right to know." Douglas looked toward the far corner of his yard. Behind the rose bushes Margaret had planted the year Caleb turned 12. The trellis there created a little shield from the kitchen windows. "A private place for a private call." "Thank you," he said. Patricia put her glove back on. "Watch yourself, Douglas." He did. That was the beginning of the end. Not because Douglas became brave in one clean moment. Life rarely offers men such flattering transformations. He did not suddenly turn into a man of action. At first, he only became a man who could no longer sleep comfortably inside his own denial. That was different. That was slower and uglier. He still cooked dinner, still greeted Serena when she entered a room, still asked Caleb about work, still placed 3 plates at the table, and folded napkins the way Margaret had done, corners even, because part of him remained ashamed to treat his own family like enemies, even after they had begun treating him like an obstacle. But on Monday afternoon, he sat across from Fletcher Crane in a third-floor office on Broad Street and told the story from the beginning. Fletcher listened the way only a careful lawyer listens, without comforting too soon and without interrupting to show intelligence. He wrote in a yellow legal pad while Douglas laid it out in order. The vase, the accusation, the call to Beatrice, Earl at the window, Patricia by the fence, Serena behind the rose bushes, Hargrove Properties. When Douglas finished, Fletcher read his notes once, turned the page and picked up the office phone. The call lasted 7 minutes. Douglas watched the ceiling fan turn slowly above them. Outside, traffic moved along Broad Street with ordinary indifference. Fletcher spoke in measured phrases, introduced himself as the attorney representing the owner of record at 114 Church Street, asked for any inquiries connected to that address, waited, wrote, underlined, wrote again, and then went very still. When he hung up, he looked at Douglas with the expression of a man confirming something he had hoped not to confirm. 4 contacts, Fletcher said, mid-July through early September. A woman identifying herself as a family representative for the Church Street property. She discussed market value, listing timelines, and how quickly a sale could move once the property was cleared of its current occupant. Douglas looked down at the legal pad. Fletcher had written the phrase in black ink, cleared of current occupant. Douglas read it twice. Not father-in-law, not owner, not Douglas, occupant. It is strange how a single word can finish a job that months of discomfort could not. Douglas felt no dramatic explosion of anger. He only felt something inside him settle into a colder shape. Fletcher asked about bank access next. Douglas told him Caleb had a supplementary card on the household account. Fletcher's face did not change, but his pen stopped moving. Go to the bank tomorrow, Fletcher said. In person. Ask for internal access history. Not statements, not online activity. Internal logs. Who called? Who asked what? Any request for account modification. 6 months minimum. The next morning, Linda Howell at First National Bank used Douglas's first name for the first time in 12 years. That alone told him enough. Douglas, she said, looking at her screen. There was a call on September 14th. A woman identified herself as the daughter-in-law and household manager of the account holder. She requested the current balance and asked about adding a joint account holder. Douglas kept both hands flat on his knees. What happened? She failed all 3 security questions. The call was denied and flagged. How long was the call? 4 minutes and 31 seconds. 4.5 minutes trying to enter his account. Not a misunderstanding, an attempt. Then Linda showed him the transactions. Spa charges, King Street salon appointments, restaurants he had never visited, online purchases shipped to addresses he recognized, gas stations on routes he did not drive. Month after month, all of it flowing from an account he had kept funded because Caleb and Serena were, as Caleb had said 18 months earlier, finding their footing. Then Douglas asked about Serena's direct deposit. Linda went still. The last deposit from her employer came through July 9th, she said. There has been nothing since. 4 months. For 4 months, Serena had left the house every weekday at 7:30 in pressed blazers and heels, carrying a work bag to a job that no longer paid her. For 4 months, Caleb had handed over his paycheck. For 4 months, Douglas had believed the household remained strained but functioning. For 4 months, the money had been leaving. Douglas signed the form, removing Caleb's supplementary access that morning. His hand did not shake. That frightened him slightly. He had expected anger to tremble through him. Instead, there was only a quiet, deliberate precision. The same precision he used when deciding whether a damaged structure could be repaired or needed to be torn down. That evening he cooked roasted chicken, mashed potatoes and green beans. It was not kindness, it was discipline. He needed to see how far Serena would go when she believed he still knew nothing. Caleb came home tired, loosened his tie, and relaxed slightly when he smelled dinner. Serena entered later in soft clothes, phone in hand, looked at the table without thanks and sat. They ate under a silence that looked ordinary from a distance. Caleb talked about traffic. Douglas asked whether the chicken needed more salt. Serena scrolled. Then she placed her phone face down and looked at Caleb. I need you to sign some paperwork this week. Caleb swallowed. What kind? Just financial restructuring forms. I marked where you need to sign. Can it wait until the weekend? I'd rather it not. The voice was pleasant. The control inside it was not. Caleb nodded. He did not ask what the forms did. Douglas sat across from him and felt the old photograph of the boy with the hammer burn in his mind. At 9 that night, Douglas passed the dining room and saw Serena standing beside Caleb's chair, one hand on the back of it, pointing to signatures on 2 pages. Caleb bent over the paper, signed where she pointed, turned the page, signed again, and signed a 3rd time without reading one line. Douglas watched for 3 seconds, then walked away. That was the moment his hesitation ended. Not because Serena had become worse. She had already revealed herself. It ended because Douglas finally understood that silence was no longer protecting Caleb. It was helping Serena keep him useful. At 9:43, Douglas called Wendell Prout, the best moving man he knew. I need your biggest truck, he said, a pause. How big are we talking? Everything of mine in a 4-bedroom house. One trip. Another pause. Doug, you sure about this? I built every piece of furniture in that house by hand. I know exactly what I'm moving. Wendell exhaled slowly. 7 in the morning. The next day, as Serena stood in the living room in her robe watching Wendell's crew carry out the oak cabinet, Douglas placed 3 documents on the table in front of her. The deed proving sole ownership, the bank access log showing the failed call, the Hargrove record showing the phrase removing the obstacle of the current occupant. Serena read them in silence. Douglas watched her face. Still no shame. Still no collapse. Only calculation. She lifted her phone as if to call the police, then stopped. Douglas said, "Are they still coming?" She did not answer. She turned, went to the master bedroom, dressed, walked out past the moving crew, and left the house without one word. Wendell looked after her car as it disappeared down Church Street. "You knew she wouldn't call?" "Yes. How?" "People with something to hide don't invite witnesses with badges." By noon, Serena had hired Raymond Vase. By the next morning, Fletcher had received the first letter. Vase argued occupancy rights, tenant at will status, harassment, improper removal of belongings, emotional distress. He was good. Douglas could see that from Fletcher's face. Good lawyers do not need to be right to be dangerous. They only need enough language to make the truth expensive. Then came the forged residency agreement. It bore Douglas's signature, his real signature, the compressed D, the long stroke through the final letters, the habit of 40 years at the bottom of a document he had never seen. Fletcher did not panic. He sent it to a forensic document analyst. The report came back brutal. The signature was genuine, but the printed agreement surrounding it was newer. Someone had lifted his signature from an older document and built a false agreement around it. They believed the signature came from a medical intake form. April 2023. Serena had accompanied Douglas to that appointment. He remembered it clearly because he had thought at the time that maybe she was trying. Margaret used to accompany him to appointments, and after Margaret died, he had gone alone. Serena offering to drive him had seemed almost kind. That memory did more damage than the forgery, because kindness, he now understood, had only been access. Douglas told Caleb everything in a corner booth at the Queen Street Cafe. He slid the folder across the table and let his son read. It took 12 minutes. Caleb turned pages slowly. Hargrove, bank records, forged agreement, forensic report, power of attorney revocation. When Caleb reached the phrase removing the obstacle of the current occupant, his eyes stayed there a long time. "She used me," Caleb said finally. Douglas did not soften it. "Yes." Caleb pressed both hands flat on the table. "I knew pieces of it. I knew she controlled things, the money, the calls, who we saw, what I asked, what I didn't ask. I kept telling myself I was being unfair if I questioned her." "That's how it works," Douglas said. Caleb looked up. Douglas saw the boy with the hammer again, but faintly now, buried under exhaustion and shame. "You saw it," Douglas said quietly. "You just chose not to look straight at it." Caleb did not deny it. He signed the revocation statement after reading every line. "This time," he said, voice low, "I'm reading before I sign." The courtroom 6 weeks later was smaller than Douglas expected. Maybe 40 seats, fewer than a dozen occupied. Serena sat beside Raymond Vase in a dark blazer with her spine straight and her hands folded. She looked composed enough to frighten him. Earl Davenport sat one row behind Douglas with his hat on his knee, prepared to testify that he had seen Serena photographing documents in Douglas's office months earlier. Caleb sat near him, hands locked together, face pale but present. Judge Patricia Holloway listened without theatrical expression. Vase made his argument first. Residency, family equity, emotional distress, an elderly homeowner acting rashly, a daughter-in-law displaced from an established home. Then Fletcher stood and placed the forensic report on the bench. The forged document did not survive 10 minutes. When Earl testified, his voice stayed even. Vase pressed him on distance, Angle, light, glasses, memory. Earl did not embellish. He did not retreat. He described exactly what he saw and no more. That made him devastating. Then Vase tried one final angle. Caleb's inheritance. Fletcher placed a notarized amendment to Douglas's will before the judge. The house would pass to Caleb and Caleb alone. Mr. Mercer is not excluding his son, Fletcher said. He is protecting his son's inheritance from a third party. The room went quiet. Judge Holloway granted the eviction order and referred the forged document for criminal review. Serena turned toward Douglas before leaving. For the first time that morning, their eyes met. There was no pleading there, no regret, only cold recognition. Douglas understood then that she did not hate him because she had failed. She hated him because he had finally made her visible. 30 days later, the rental truck arrived for Serena's belongings. Douglas did not watch from the window. He stayed in the kitchen and made coffee while movers carried out boxes, clothes, framed prints, decorative lamps, and the remaining evidence of a life Serena had tried to install inside a house that was never hers. Caleb stood in the hallway, silent. Neither man spoke until the truck pulled away. Then Douglas poured 2 mugs and set one before his son. "You all right?" Caleb asked. Douglas looked at him across the table. "I built this house 37 years ago. I've watched more storms come through than you've had birthdays. The house is still standing." He lifted his mug. "So am I." It was not the whole truth, but it was enough for that morning. The criminal case did not bring dramatic justice. It brought paperwork, interviews, statements, delay, and a plea agreement that left Douglas feeling less victorious than emptied. Serena pled guilty to felony document forgery, a suspended sentence, restitution, a conviction on record. A prior Georgia case resurfaced. Same pattern, older victim, coastal property, forged residency pressure. Settlement forced through the old man's son. Serena had practiced before. Caleb learned that over lunch and went very still. "She practiced on me," he said. Douglas did not correct him. Months passed. The house changed again. Not back to what it had been. Back was impossible. Douglas had stopped believing in back. He signed an agreement with the Low Country Housing Initiative to convert the 2 north bedrooms upstairs into affordable apartments for retired tradespeople who had built Charleston's beauty without ever being allowed to own any part of it. Bill Rafferty, a mason Douglas had known for decades, had died alone in a rented room on Cannon Street with no window facing the street. 8 people attended his funeral. Douglas had counted them and never forgotten. Caleb helped with the renovation. Every morning he showed up with coffee, tools, and a quiet willingness to be useful. Trust did not return in a clean line. Sometimes Douglas still watched him too carefully. Sometimes Caleb went silent when paperwork appeared. Sometimes both men found themselves standing in rooms full of old memories without knowing how to speak over them. Damage did not disappear because a court signed an order. Betrayal did not become wisdom simply because people survived it. But Caleb read every document now. That mattered. One January afternoon, Walter Gaines, a retired Finnish carpenter with hands like old lumber and shoulders still broad from 45 years in the trade, walked through the upstairs unit and pressed his palm to the wall. "Good build," Walter said. "Who did these walls?" "I did," Douglas said, 37 years ago. Walter looked at him more closely. Recognition moved slowly across his face. "Doug Mercer, Wentworth Street Project, 1994. The concrete pour," Douglas said. "Wrong angle on the east approach. Had to break it up and start over." Walter laughed, deep and tired. Site supervisor screamed for 3 hours. He didn't have much hair left to pull. They stood there in the half-finished apartment, surrounded by drywall dust and winter light. 2 old men who had spent their lives making things stand for people who rarely remembered their names. Walter asked why Douglas was doing it. Douglas told him about Bill Rafferty. Walter looked at the window for a long time. Then he said, "I'll take the apartment." "I know you will," Douglas said. Later, Caleb found a wall half an inch off the plan. "I know," Douglas said. "You know, I left it." "Why?" Douglas rested his hand on the frame. "Because no structure is perfectly plumb in every direction. That half-inch reminds whoever comes after me that a person built this, not a machine. A man with a level and a chalk line who did his best, and whose best was good enough even when it wasn't perfect." Caleb wrote in the margin of his notebook. Intentional, do not correct. Douglas looked at those words longer than he meant to. Outside, Church Street rested in the late afternoon light. Earl Davenport stood at the fence for a moment, hat in his hand, looking up at the north face of the house. He nodded once, slow and final, then went inside. The house held. It had always held, but Douglas no longer confused holding with healing. That was the final lesson the house taught him after everything. A structure can remain standing and still carry damage deep inside its walls. A man can win a case, reclaim a deed, protect his son, expose a lie, and still wake some mornings with the taste of humiliation in his mouth. Survival is not restoration. Justice is not peace. Family betrayal does not end when the betrayer leaves the driveway. It stays in the rooms afterward. It sits in the quiet places. It changes how a man hears footsteps in his own hallway. Douglas lived with that. So did Caleb. So did the house. And every time Douglas ran his palm across the old wood of the stair rail, feeling the dents and worn edges and places where decades had pressed themselves into the grain, he understood something cold and permanent. He had saved the house, but the house had also shown him exactly what he had almost allowed himself to lose. Not ownership, not money, not furniture. His own willingness to look directly at the truth. That was the thing betrayal had nearly taken first, and that was the thing he never again intended to give away. There were days after Serena left, when Douglas found himself standing in the center of a room with no purpose, listening for sounds that were no longer there. The absence was not peaceful at first. It was suspicious. For months the house had trained him to expect her heels on the floor, the slight pause before she entered a room, the cool inventory of her eyes as she measured what could be used and what could be dismissed. Silence did not immediately feel like relief. It felt like the pause before impact. He would wake before dawn, lie still, and wait for some new accusation to form in the hallway. Some mornings he caught himself reviewing the previous day, as if preparing for cross-examination. Had he left a cup in the sink? Had he moved mail from the entry table? Had he spoken too sharply to Caleb? Had he forgotten something she could turn into evidence? Then he would remember she was gone, and the remembering would not comfort him as quickly as he thought it should. That was what people misunderstood about escape. They imagined the door closing behind the dangerous person and the air clearing all at once. They imagined sunlight entering. They imagined music, coffee, laughter returning to its old place at the table. But Douglas learned that when a person has lived too long under someone else's invented reality, the mind does not immediately trust the real one. It checks the walls, it tests the logs, it listens for the hidden cost. Caleb went through his own version of that same wreckage. He stayed in the house for several weeks after the eviction, though technically he no longer needed to. At first he slept in the back bedroom, the old one from childhood, the room where airplane decals still left faint discolorations on the closet door if the light hit it right. He said he wanted to help with repairs. Douglas let him say that. Both men knew it was not only repairs. Caleb was learning how to occupy space without asking permission from a voice that was no longer in the room. The first time Douglas watched his son open a bank statement alone, he looked away because the sight felt too private. Caleb sat at the kitchen table for almost 40 minutes with one page in front of him, reading every line, circling fees, writing notes, going back to the top, reading again. When he finished, he folded the statement slowly and pressed both hands against it. "I didn't know how much I didn't know," he said. Douglas was standing at the sink washing a coffee mug. He did not turn around. Knowing starts somewhere. Caleb gave a small laugh, but there was no humor in it. "That sounds like something you'd say to a guy who just cut a board wrong. It works for boards too." The laugh came again, a little more real this time, then died quickly. "Dad." Douglas dried the mug and set it on the rack. "I'm sorry I made you small in your own house." Douglas held still. Caleb's voice thickened. "I didn't do it the way she did. I know that, but I let it happen. I let her move you into the small room. I let her talk over you. I let her call this our home like you were a guest who had overstayed. I heard things. I saw things. I told myself it was marriage, stress, adjustment, money, personality, anything except what it was. And every time I looked away, you had to live another day inside what I refused to name." Douglas placed both hands on the counter and looked down at the sink. "There are apologies that ask for comfort, and there are apologies that arrive carrying their own punishment. Caleb's was the second kind. Douglas heard no request inside it, no invitation to say it was fine, no softening. His son had finally looked directly at the structure and seen the damage. "It happened," Douglas said. Caleb nodded behind him. "I know. I'm not ready to make it smaller than it was. I know that too." The house was quiet after that. No forgiveness arrived with violins. No father and son embraced beside the kitchen sink. Douglas kept drying dishes. Caleb kept sitting at the table. But something honest had entered the room, and honest things do not always feel warm when they arrive. Sometimes they feel like winter air entering a house that has been shut too long. The legal aftermath stretched longer than Douglas wanted. There were calls from the district attorney's office. There were requests for documentation he had already provided twice. There were forms that asked him to reduce 18 months of humiliation into neat boxes and dated lines. There were moments when Fletcher's voice on the phone became the only thing keeping him from hanging up and letting the whole criminal matter collapse under its own weight. The civil case had given him the house back. The criminal case demanded he keep revisiting the rooms inside himself where Serena had done the most damage. One prosecutor, a younger woman named Maren Holt, met with Douglas in a conference room that smelled faintly of printer toner and old coffee. She had kind eyes, which Douglas distrusted at first because kindness in official buildings often came attached to limits. She placed a recorder on the table and asked him to describe the first moment he believed Serena had intended to defraud him. Douglas almost said Hargrove. Then he almost said the bank. Then he thought of the vase. He thought of Serena turning too quickly, choosing him too fast. "The vase," he said. Maren looked up from her notes. "The vase was not part of the financial fraud." "No," Douglas said, "but it was the first time I understood she could break something and make the room agree I had done it." Maren wrote that down. Douglas watched the pen move and realized that sentence mattered more than some of the bank records. Money could be traced, documents could be analyzed, forgery could be proven with ink and dates. But the earlier violence, the daily pressure that prepared the room to accept the larger crime, lived in gestures and tone and the trained silence of people around her. Serena had not begun with forged documents. She had begun with small rearrangements. A vase, a bedroom, a bill, a dinner conversation, a joke made at his expense while Caleb looked at his plate, a repeated suggestion that Douglas was forgetful, hovering, difficult, fragile. By the time she reached for the house, she had already spent 18 months trying to make him seem like a man who did not deserve to keep it. That realization changed how Douglas remembered everything. He remembered the first month after Caleb and Serena moved in. Serena had taken over the pantry without discussion, throwing out old spices Margaret had labeled by hand because, as she put it, expired things make a kitchen feel neglected. Douglas had laughed awkwardly then, unsure why the comment stung. He remembered opening the trash later and seeing Margaret's small glass jars lying among coffee grounds and onion skins. He had taken one out, wiped it clean, and placed it in the back of his closet because it still had Margaret's handwriting on it. Time, 2016. He had never told anyone. He remembered Serena moving his work boots from the mudroom to the garage because guests shouldn't have to see that. He remembered Caleb saying, "It's just boots, Dad," not unkindly, just tired. He remembered Serena replacing the porch cushions Margaret had sewn with pale, expensive ones that could not be left in the rain, then telling Beatrice on the phone that she was trying to bring the house forward. He remembered the first time she referred to the house as Caleb's inheritance in front of friends, while Douglas sat in the room alive and unpaid for. Everyone laughed as if it were a sweet family remark. Douglas smiled too, because he did not want to look petty. Every small surrender had seemed easier than conflict. That was how a house changed owners before the day'd ever moved. Not legally, psychologically. By the time the prosecutor finished with him, Douglas felt as if he had spent 3 hours digging through old plaster with his bare hands. He walked out of the courthouse into sunlight and had to sit on a bench for 10 minutes before he could drive. People passed him carrying briefcases and lunch bags. A young couple argued softly near the curb. A delivery driver cursed at traffic. The city kept moving. Douglas pressed both palms together and breathed slowly until his hands stopped feeling cold. The day Serena entered her plea, Douglas did not attend the hearing. Fletcher went. Caleb went because he had been subpoenaed, and then excused after the plea deal removed the need for full testimony. Douglas stayed at 114 Church Street, and sanded the edge of a window frame in the north unit until the wood turned warm under his hand. He thought he would feel cowardly for not going. He did not. There are rooms a man does not need to enter just because someone else built a door to them. Fletcher called afterward. "It's done," he said. Douglas kept sanding. "What did she say?" "Very little." "Yes, Your Honor." "No, Your Honor." She admitted to submitting a forged document. She did not apologize. Douglas nodded, though Fletcher could not see him. "Of course she didn't." There was a pause on the line. "The conviction is real, Douglas." "I know." "Restitution will be processed through the court." "I know." "And the Georgia matter is under review." Douglas stopped sanding and looked toward the window. Church Street was quiet. Earl's curtains were open. Across the way, Patricia Sims was carrying a watering can toward her back garden. "She'll find another room if they let her," Douglas said. Fletcher did not answer immediately. "Maybe." "No," Douglas said. "Not maybe. People like that don't stop because they're ashamed. They stop only when every door gets watched." Another silence. Then Fletcher said, "That is why public record matters." Douglas looked down at the frame beneath his hand. "Then let it be public." After the plea, reporters called. Not many, but enough. Charleston liked old houses, family property disputes, forged documents, and women in blazers who turned out not to be what their neighbors believed. Douglas declined interviews. Caleb declined too. Earl said if anyone came to his porch, he would turn the hose on them, and Douglas believed him. Patricia brought over a casserole one evening without mentioning the case at all, which Douglas appreciated more than anything she could have said. She placed it on the counter and looked around the kitchen, now stripped of Serena's decorative pieces, and returned to plain usefulness. "It feels like your house again," Patricia said. Douglas looked at the empty space above the sideboard, where Serena had once hung a gold-framed mirror he hated. "It feels like a house deciding what it is now." Patricia nodded. "That may be better." He did not know if it was better. Better was too simple. He had become suspicious of simple words. Safer, over, fine. He avoided all of them. He preferred accurate words. Quiet, legal, standing, changed. The renovation gave them work, and work gave shape to days that might otherwise have collapsed inward. Caleb learned the upstairs rooms by hand. He learned which floorboards creaked because of old settlement and which needed reinforcement. He learned that the east wall carried more weight than it appeared to carry. He learned how to mark measurements cleanly and how to correct a cut without cursing at the wood. Some days Douglas taught him patiently. Some days he snapped. Some days Caleb snapped back. Their arguments were never large, but they were real. And that mattered too because Serena's house had allowed no real disagreement unless she directed it. Real disagreement meant both men still existed. One afternoon Caleb measured a door frame 3 times and still cut the trim wrong. He stared at the piece in his hand, jaw tight, shame rising too quickly. "I ruined it," he said. Douglas looked at the trim. "You cut it short." "That's what I said." "No, you said ruined. It's a board, Caleb, not a life." Caleb looked at him sharply. Douglas held his gaze. "We cut another." For a moment Caleb's face did something young and wounded, and Douglas understood that the lesson was not about trim. Serena had made mistakes into evidence, evidence into character, character into sentence. A short board was not a failure. It was a short board. They cut another. Walter Gaines moved into the first North Unit in early spring. He arrived with 2 suitcases, 3 toolboxes, and a framed photograph of a woman he introduced only as Marion. He placed the photograph on the windowsill before unpacking anything else. Douglas saw that and said nothing. Men in their 70s often carried entire marriages in one framed picture and one careful silence. The second unit went to a woman named Gloria Baines, a retired plaster finisher who had spent 38 years restoring ceilings in houses where she would never be invited to dinner. She was small, direct, and unimpressed by sentiment. On move-in day she walked the room, touched the walls, inspected the window trim, and said, "This will do." Douglas laughed for the first time that day. Gloria looked at him. "Was that funny?" "No," Douglas said. "It was perfect." By summer the house had a new rhythm. Walter's radio played softly upstairs in the mornings. Gloria grew herbs in clay pots on the back landing. Caleb came by 3 evenings a week, sometimes to work, sometimes just to sit. Douglas remained in the smallest bedroom at the end of the hall, because he had not yet decided whether to return to the master bedroom. Caleb asked once if he wanted it back. Douglas thought about it. No, he said. Why not? Douglas looked down the hallway. Some rooms don't become yours again just because someone leaves them. Caleb nodded as if he understood, and perhaps he did. The master bedroom eventually became a common room for Walter and Gloria, with bookshelves along one wall and a table near the window where bills, letters, puzzles, and coffee cups accumulated. Margaret's room became something useful to people still living. Douglas thought she would have liked that. He hoped so. Hope, he had learned, was safest when kept modest. The last time Douglas saw Serena was not in court. It was outside a grocery store on Meeting Street, almost a year after the vase broke. He was loading a bag into his truck when he felt someone looking at him. He turned and saw her near the cart return. She wore sunglasses and a cream coat despite the heat. Her hair cut shorter, her posture still perfect. For a moment, neither moved. There are meetings that ask for words. This one did not. Serena looked at him with the same cold recognition she had shown in court. But something had changed. Not remorse, not defeat, only adjustment. She was already becoming another version of herself, one that would tell the story differently, one where she had been misunderstood, cornered, betrayed, punished too harshly by a family that never accepted her. Douglas knew that because he finally understood her. People like Serena did not carry guilt. They carried drafts. He shut the truck door. She smiled faintly. Then she walked away. Douglas watched until she disappeared behind a row of parked cars. His hands were steady. His heart was not. The body remembers danger long after the mind has filed the paperwork. That night he sat on the porch until midnight. Caleb called around 9, and Douglas let it ring because he did not want to explain why seeing Serena for less than 20 seconds had unsettled him more than the plea hearing. Earl's porch light stayed on across the yard. At 10, Earl stepped outside, looked over, and raised one hand. Douglas raised his back. Neither crossed the lawn. Some companionship does not require interruption. Near midnight, Douglas went inside, paused in the living room, and looked at the side table where the vase had shattered. The table remained. The vase did not. He had never replaced it. For months, the empty space bothered visitors. People wanted a lamp there, flowers, a bowl, something. Douglas left it empty. It was not a shrine. It was not bitterness. It was evidence of another kind. A clear space where something beautiful had been broken and falsely assigned to him. He wanted the house to remember accurately. He touched the table once, then turned off the light. Years from now, maybe Caleb would inherit the house and decide what to do with that space. Maybe he would place a photograph there. Maybe a plant. Maybe nothing. Douglas no longer tried to control the meaning of every future room. He had learned that love was not the same as surrendering control to someone else's appetite. He had also learned that leaving a thing to a child did not mean leaving that child unprotected from the people who would use love as a crowbar. The house held, but not because it was untouched. It held because someone finally looked at the crack and refused to call it normal. And every morning after that, when Douglas woke in the small room at the end of the hall, listened to Walter's radio upstairs, Gloria's footsteps on the back landing, Caleb's truck sometimes pulling into the drive before breakfast, Earl's hose clicking on across the yard, he understood the cost of waiting and the cost of acting. Waiting had cost him peace. Acting had cost him illusion. Only one of those could be rebuilt.